1942. The world was burning in the chaos of World War II. Oceans turned into battlegrounds, skies swarmed with fighter planes, and young men were being drafted into a conflict that promised heroism, sacrifice, and glory. But behind the patriotic posters and the marching drums, something far darker was unfolding on American soil. An experiment that would scar thousands of soldiers long after the war had ended. It began quietly, in hidden corners of U.S. military bases across Maryland, Panama, and several other classified locations. These weren't enemy territories. These were places meant to protect American lives. Yet within their walls, nearly 60,000 U.S. servicemen, sons, brothers, husbands, unknowingly became human test subjects in a secret project to study the effects of mustard gas and lewisite, chemical agents so deadly they had once been banned under international law. The official story was that these tests were routine, part of developing better protective clothing and ointments in case chemical warfare erupted again as it had in World War I. But the truth was far more haunting. The young soldiers were told little, often nothing, about what they were walking into. They were told it was for training. Some were even promised special leave, medals, or promotions. In reality, they were being led into sealed chambers filled with poison. Once inside, the gas would be released, an invisible fog of death that clung to their skin, burned their lungs, and left blisters oozing with yellow pus. The pain was unbearable. Some screamed, others fainted, and some simply stood in disbelief, realizing too late that their government had turned them into experiments. The researchers, wearing gas masks and protective suits, observed through glass windows, taking notes, recording every cough, every burn, every desperate cry. The soldiers were told to endure as long as possible. Some were forced to stay inside until their skin bubbled and peeled. When the testing ended, they were told to shower, but the water only spread the chemical deeper into their pores. They were given ointments and sent away, often with the order to stay silent. "It's classified," they were told, "for your country." Many obeyed, believing they were helping the war effort, believing their suffering had meaning. But as the years passed, the truth began to surface. Their bodies began to fail them. Some developed chronic respiratory diseases. Others found their skin breaking down years later, the blisters never fully healing. Many were diagnosed with cancer, their lungs scarred beyond repair. The pain became a lifelong shadow. And when they sought medical help, when they tried to tell their stories, they were dismissed. There were no records. The government denied it happened. Veterans' hospitals claimed ignorance. The men were left to wonder. Were they forgotten or intentionally erased? Imagine being a 19-year-old soldier from Kansas or Ohio, proud to serve your country, signing up to defend freedom. You think you're training to fight the enemy, and instead, you're locked in a gas chamber by your own army. The gas stings your eyes, your chest tightens, you can't breathe, your skin feels like it's melting. You bang on the metal door, screaming to get out, but the officers just take notes. You think this is just another drill, but your body knows better. The air is poison. You survived the day. But the war never leaves your body. For decades, these men carried invisible wounds. They were sworn to secrecy under threat of military discipline. Many didn't even tell their families. They lived with guilt, confusion, and pain, never understanding why their government had used them like lab rats. When the war ended in 1945, the world celebrated victory and peace. But for these soldiers, peace never came. They returned home still coughing, still covered in scars. Their wives and children watched them age faster than normal, their health crumbling from the inside out. Yet no one listened. No medals, no recognition, no apology. It wasn't until nearly 50 years later, in the 1990s, that the truth finally broke through the silence. Declassified documents revealed the horrifying details. The U.S. government had intentionally exposed its own soldiers to mustard gas and lewisite to study their effects on human skin and lungs. The experiments were conducted under strict secrecy by the U.S. Army and Navy, beginning in 1942, when fears of chemical warfare ran high. They wanted to know, if the Japanese or Germans used gas, would American troops survive? Could protective gear save them? Would ointments heal their burns? And so they tested, not on mannequins or lab animals, but on their own men. Some tests took place in tropical heat in Panama, others in humid chambers in Maryland's Edgewood Arsenal. In some experiments, they released the gas into open fields, ordering soldiers to march through the clouds. In others, they placed them in small sealed rooms, the air growing thick and acidic, and observed as their bodies broke down. The scientists noted how long it took for skin to blister, how fast breathing became impossible, how long before collapse. And when the tests were over, they told the soldiers to forget. Decades later, when the Department of Veterans Affairs finally admitted the truth, the men who were still alive were elderly, many suffering from cancer, emphysema, and chronic bronchitis. Some were blind, some had lost limbs. Many couldn't afford the medical care they needed. Even with proof, compensation was hard to get. They were told they needed official records, but most of those files had been destroyed or lost. It was as if history itself had been rewritten to erase their pain. Yet they remembered. They remembered the smell of the gas, the heat of their own skin burning, the screams of their friends. They remembered being told, "It's for your country." One veteran, speaking in an interview decades later, said, "They didn't shoot us. They just burned us slowly." Another said he could still feel the burns whenever he breathed. These weren't soldiers who refused to serve. These were men who followed orders, trusting their leaders. The betrayal cut deeper than the burns ever could. And yet, even in their suffering, most of them didn't speak with hatred. They spoke with heartbreak that the country they loved had treated them as expendable. Mustard gas, known chemically as sulfur mustard, is a blister agent that attacks the skin, eyes, and respiratory system. When it touches human tissue, it causes painful burns and deep blisters that can take weeks or months to heal. Inhalation can destroy the lungs, leading to chronic disease or death. During World War I, it was responsible for tens of thousands of casualties. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 banned the use of chemical weapons, but fears persisted that Axis powers might still use them. The U.S. military justified its testing by claiming it was preparing for that threat. But the question remains, at what moral cost? These experiments violated every principle of informed consent, every standard of human ethics. The men were not told what they were being exposed to, nor were they warned of the long-term consequences. They were not given the choice to refuse. Many were selected based on race. Black, Japanese American, and Puerto Rican soldiers were used to test how different skin types reacted to gas exposure, a cruel and racist pseudoscience that added another layer of injustice. Years later, historians would describe these tests as a national shame, a scar on the record of American wartime research. The soldiers' courage was never in question. It was the leadership's conscience that failed them. It's haunting to think that while Americans were fighting tyranny overseas, some were being subjected to inhuman experiments at home. The irony is painful. The U.S. condemned Nazi doctors for war crimes after the war, for performing human experiments without consent, even as it had conducted its own on American citizens. As the decades passed, the story faded into whispers. Veterans died one by one, taking their secrets to the grave. But in the 1990s, investigative journalists and historians began to piece together the truth. The Department of Veterans Affairs finally acknowledged the tests, promising compensation and medical care to survivors. The apology came too late for most. Many had already passed away, buried without recognition, their families unaware of what had really happened. Imagine their final years, old men sitting in small living rooms, coughing into handkerchiefs, haunted by memories they weren't supposed to have. Some still had the military's letter framed on the wall, believing they had done something noble. They had no idea that the gas that made them sick came not from the enemy, but from their own side. Their courage deserves remembrance, not just as victims, but as reminders of what happens when fear and secrecy override humanity. The mustard gas experiments on U.S. soldiers remain one of the darkest, least discussed chapters in American military history. It's a story of pain, silence, and betrayal, but also of endurance. Because despite everything, many of those men continued to serve, continued to believe in the ideals of the country that had hurt them. That paradox, loving the very nation that wounded you, defines the tragic heroism of those soldiers. They were promised protection. Instead, they became the test subjects for it. And so, when we look back at 1942, we must remember that war is not only fought on the battlefield. Sometimes it's fought in laboratories, in sealed chambers, in the name of science and security. Sometimes the victims wear the same uniform as the heroes. The mustard gas experiments remind us that the true test of a nation's strength isn't how well it fights its enemies, but how it treats its own. Even today, traces of that history remain. Some of the testing sites still exist. Overgrown, abandoned, their soil contaminated with remnants of the chemicals once released there. Veterans' families still seek recognition, still file claims, still demand justice. But history moves slowly. For every name lost, for every story buried, there remains a duty to remember. The men who endured those experiments didn't have the luxury of understanding what was happening to them. But we do, and with that understanding comes responsibility. To speak, to teach, to ensure it never happens again. Because silence protects no one. So as you hear this story, remember the faces behind it. The young soldier standing in a gas chamber in Maryland, coughing and praying it would end soon. The officer watching from behind glass, taking notes as his skin blistered. The decades of silence that followed. The broken promises. The lost lives. And the truth that finally emerged from the shadows. Too late to heal, but not too late to learn. The mustard gas experiments were not just a failure of ethics. They were a tragedy of trust. They remind us that patriotism should never mean blind obedience, and that loyalty should never be used as a weapon against the loyal. Every soldier who suffered in those tests carried the weight of two wars, one against an enemy abroad, and one against betrayal at home. History often remembers battles, victories, and generals, but true remembrance lies in stories like this, the hidden ones, the painful ones, the ones that force us to confront the cost of secrecy. The mustard gas experiments on U.S. soldiers stand as a haunting echo from the past, whispering a warning that power without compassion can destroy even its own protectors. And so, as the years stretch on, and the memory of World War II fades into textbooks and documentaries, let us not forget the men who were silenced in the name of progress. Their suffering was not an accident. It was a choice made in laboratories where fear outweighed humanity. Their legacy should not be forgotten in the noise of history. It should be spoken, remembered, and honored, not as a tale of shame, but as a lesson for the generations who come after, because only by remembering can we ensure that no nation, no matter how powerful or righteous it believes itself to be, ever repeats the mistake of turning its heroes into experiments again. That was 1942 to 1945, the years when the greatest democracy in the world tested poison on its own defenders. A time when secrecy suffocated truth, when patriotism was manipulated into silence, and when 60,000 American soldiers became unknowing witnesses to one of the darkest experiments in military history. And today, their story still asks a question that echoes through time. How far should a nation go in the name of protection before it becomes the thing it fears most?